So will we see potential Hurricane Humberto as well as potential Hurricane Imelda impact the United States in the near future? Well, it really depends, as it's going to be a very interesting forecast because we do have some scenarios in the GFS and the European model taking the worst case scenario, bringing a direct landfall right over the United States, while we also have the better case, which would steer this storm out to sea thanks to a trough that would dig in and pretty much weaken this ridge to allow this storm system to have an open lane to just stay off the United States coast. Well, as of right now, we see that here's Tropical Storm Imelda and here's Tropical Storm Humberto, which likely will develop into Hurricane Humberto once the wind shear begins to wind down. So the key thing will be how strong this ridge will be just to the north of these two storm systems, as there's expected to be a trough that's going to be centered right over eastern Canada. And another factor that will play a major role in terms of its trajectory is how close these two tropical cyclones will be to each other, as well as the strength between the two, because that could create a Fujiwara effect where these storm systems will begin to rotate, pretty much surround around each other and do a little bit of maneuvers, just spinning around, potentially closer to land before it maybe goes out to sea, as that's going to be a very interesting thing we're going to need to pay close attention to over the next few days to really determine if there's a possibility we could see this potentially move a little bit further westward. So we see in the current GFS model scenario, it is taking Imelda further northward. The reason being is that there is an upper level trough right here, as well as a ridge located just to the west of it, and it's creating somewhat of a stronger southerly flow, which will force Imelda to the north. That is something that we're fairly certain with at this point. What does become more uncertain is how far north that moves, because we don't know necessarily how quick this trough right over eastern Canada will dig in. And of course, we don't know how strong this ridge will be and the interactions between these two storm systems, which makes this forecast fairly difficult. However, I will say with Humberto, while there is still a possibility this could move closer to the United States East Coast, I will still say that the more likely scenario is that Humberto will eventually move out to sea, as it's fairly rare, especially during the month of September, especially late September at that. We see a ridge that's strong enough and persistent enough to stay over one area without being eroded away by the strong westerly winds and just overall the stronger instability that is associated with a cooling northern hemisphere that increases the westerly winds, and that just makes ridging as well as troughs move a lot more quickly and erode a lot more quickly when we see a more unstable environment like this during the late month of September. So although we do see a strong ridge just to the north of these two storm systems, it is fairly rare in any given time period, let alone late September, for a ridge to be that persistent and at least strong enough to steer storms to the west. And in Humberto's case, especially since it's further eastward and it's in the area that's a little bit it's in an area where the ridge is a little bit weaker, that will allow for a more open area for Humberto to more likely move out to sea. But when we're talking about a forecast that's relatively far out, especially when we're talking about Humberto being right next to another tropical cyclone, that does make the forecast a bit more uncertain. So we can't rule out that possibility that maybe it could move eastward just yet, because westward just yet, because the Fujiwara effect, although the troughing may be strong just to the northeast of Humberto, the Fujiwara effect might be stronger to be able to somewhat steer this storm system further westward, which isn't out of the realm of possibilities either. So I want you guys to keep that in mind. So hopefully this trend continues where Humberto stays out to sea. I do think that's a little bit more likely than this heading straight towards the west, but we can't rule out any possibilities this far out. So still, just stay tuned for further updates for the East Coast. Now, when it comes to Imelda, it does become more interesting, and I will say this is a tropical cyclone that has the higher possibility of impacting the United States. For one thing is that it's already in a location further westward, so it's already close enough to the United States where if it were to move a little bit further westward, that could make it the difference between it making landfall and it just staying off the sea, unlike Humberto, which is still ways to the east, which does give it a little bit, the United States, a little bit more of a safety cushion when it comes to potential Hurricane Humberto, because Humberto would need to go pretty out of its way to the west to impact you guys. But it's not the case with Imelda. It's already located fairly west, and not only that, since it's further westward, it would be able to encounter of the stronger amount of ridging, and it would be a little bit more disconnected from this troughing over eastern Canada. So it would make it a little bit more difficult for this to go out to sea without at least bringing a little bit of impacts to the United States. However, the forecast is still highly uncertain, and like I said, with the potential of a Fujiwara effect, there is that possibility maybe this Humberto would steer the storm system a little bit further eastward, because especially it also depends on the strength of Imelda, because if Imelda is relatively weak, that would make it more likely it would gravitate straight towards Humberto, and then Humberto just absorbs Imelda completely and just moves straight out into the east. But if Imelda's a little bit stronger, then it could hold its own. It won't necessarily be absorbed by Humberto. Rather, in that scenario, especially if it's close enough, it would do a little bit of a dance near Humberto, where it could potentially spin around a little bit, maybe spin a little bit further eastward, or maybe spin closer to the coast. That's a possibility, as well as typically in a scenario like this, tropical cyclones like to move around when they're in close proximity to each other. So that's definitely something we need to keep in mind as well. In the GFS model scenario, we see that it does bring some impacts to North Carolinas, where we do see some rainfall. If we were to take a look at the forecast precipitation, we do see a little bit of impacts, but it's a fairly weak storm. There isn't much to it, which is another thing we need to pay close attention to, is that the computer models aren't necessarily expecting this to be as strong as Humberto due to several factors. For one thing, is that it's already in a fairly disorganized state. Taking a quick look at what will likely become hurricane or tropical storm Imelda, we see that it's mainly a disorganized area of showers. There is strong wind shear over it. It isn't as organized as Humberto right now, so it's going to be a little bit more difficult for this to develop a center of circulation over the next few days. And plus, it might move over the mountainous terrain of Dominican Republic, which will make it a little bit more difficult for it to strengthen right away, as the wind shear, although the wind shear is expected to wind down by the time this approaches northward and eventually into the Bahamas, it's only a matter of time before it encounters stronger wind shear again over Florida, as well as dry air associated with that stronger wind shear. Taking a look again at the GFS model, we see that there is a stronger amount of westerly wind shear right over what will likely become tropical storm Imelda, and then eventually it does approach the Bahamas, but we do see the wind shear enhance again due to an upper level trough that's located right over the southeast at this time. It isn't necessarily super strong, and it does help that it doesn't help that Imelda is moving the same direction as the upper level winds, so that won't make the wind shear as strong as it could be, because although the difference in wind strength is strong between the lower levels and the upper levels, it's moving the same direction, so it won't necessarily be enough to completely kill off this storm either, based on the GFS model's scenario. And while we don't see necessarily a center of circulation, it still certainly exists, but thankfully in the GFS model scenario, the GFS model isn't expecting it to really strengthen beyond a tropical storm. And if we were to take a look at the European model, it's fairly similar to the most part. It is a little bit stronger in the European model scenario, but the wind shear just is a little bit too strong. So the key thing will definitely be how strong the wind shear will be, as well how strong Imelda will be. The current consensus is right around strong tropical storm, maybe low end category 1 hurricane for Imelda. But I also want to show you guys the 12Z run of the European model when it comes to a more long term future, because I know many people would be a bit concerned in a scenario like this, where we do see Imelda eventually move to the east like Humberto. But what's pretty different with the 12Z run of the European model scenario is that it expects this ridge to become so strong and eventually move so far to the east, where although Imelda would have an open lane to move out to sea, this ridge becomes so strong to where it brings Imelda back closer to the west and brings direct impacts to the east coast. Again, this is super far. This is a guess at this point, so definitely take this with a grain of salt. But it's definitely going to be very interesting when it comes to Imelda's track. At the very least, I do expect a tropical storm out of this. It will likely bring impacts to Bahamas and Turks and Caicos, so you want to make sure of that. And then beyond that point, it does become a little bit more uncertain. I will say more likely there will at least be enhanced rain showers over the Carolinas going into next week. So you definitely want to pay very close attention to that. And just stay tuned for more updates with this. Here's a look at the ensemble members, and they do so a slightly more concerning scenario where a lot of the ensemble members do take direct impacts right over the mid-Atlantic coast in both the European model and the GFS model scenario. Of course, there is a decent amount of spread between, especially with the GFS model, where a lot of them do take it out to sea, but we still do have a decent amount of some members, not ruling out that possibility that this might just straight move up northward. It might be just far enough to the west to where it won't necessarily be influenced by this trough dip over the northern Atlantic, like what likely will happen with Humberto. So we could so there is a decent possibility this could impact the United States. Still too early to say, but make sure to stay tuned for further updates. But that's it for now, guys, and I thank you guys for watching. Make sure to subscribe if you want to see more hurricane season videos and winter weather videos in the future. And I hope you guys all have a great day. And make sure to stay tuned for more updates regarding these two storms, because it's going to be very interesting and somewhat of a difficult thing to forecast when we're talking about two tropical cyclones so close to each other. So make sure to stay tuned for that, and I thank you guys for watching.